Mr. Kansian, thank you for being here.
Well, thanks for having me on the show.
Why will Russia conduct these military exercises in the Caribbean Sea?
Well, there are two reasons. The first is that Russia has been doing these sorts of things periodically since the end of the Cold War. Every few years, it will send ships to Cuba. It sends ships to Venezuela, for example. It sends aircraft to both countries. And it does this to show that it is still a world power, that it still has a global reach, and it harkens back to the days when Russia was truly a superpower. There's also additional meaning. They're also doing this during the Ukraine war to make the point that Russia still has military power available, that it still has a powerful navy, and that this navy remains powerful even after the losses they've taken in the Black Sea, where the Ukrainians have really got the upper hand in the Black Sea over the Russian fleet.
They do it periodically. I mean,
They
they do
do.
it yes, they do it sometimes. Is there anything special this time?
I don't know if it's special this time, and they have 4 ships, including a major combatant and a submarine, plus 2 support ships. That's a pretty large group. I know it's not a single ship, and I think the last time a ship visited Nicaragua, for instance, or Venezuela, it was a single ship. So the fact that there are several ships is significant, but you have to keep in mind this is relatively small deployment. A U.S. carrier battle group, for example, is maybe 10 times the size. Has 6 ships instead of 4, and they're much more powerful ships. So this does not threaten the United States. It makes a political point.
Some analysts say this is a kind of message for the United States. What do you think?
The Russians are sending a message not just to the United States, but to all of the Americas. And the message is that the Russians are still a global power. They still have the ability to send military forces into the Western Hemisphere, and that they still have interests in the Western Hemisphere. So they're talking to the United States and to other countries in the Western Hemisphere. This is not a military threat. The forces, although significant for the Russians, are much smaller than the U.S. Navy. They're making a political and diplomatic point.
According to the experience, how do you think those exercises are going to be? What are they going to do?
Well, they'll conduct likely some routine exercises with the Cubans. These exercises have a couple of points whenever a country does them or 2 countries do them together. One is to rehearse the ability to operate together, because any 2 navies have different procedures, they have different communications, and it just takes a lot of work to get them to work together. And there's also an element of training for the crews. The Russian ships don't get to deploy very often. That's probably true of the Cubans also. So the crews get practice. And then there's this diplomatic aspect. So what they actually do is not really all that relevant. They may practice some war fighting techniques. They may practice something relatively benign, like humanitarian assistance or rescues at sea. They're sending the message and doing the training regardless of what it is they actually do.
What do you think about all of this?
Well, this is a long-standing Russian effort. That is, the Russians have always felt since the end of the Cold War that they are still a major power. They remember the days of being a superpower, and Putin particularly remembers those days. And this is one more reflection of their desire to show the world that they are a major power. So we're going to continue to see this, probably not very often. Every year or 2, there's probably be some Russian group that comes to a country in the Western Hemisphere. I doubt if they'll set up, anything really permanent, but it will continue because this is deep inside the Russian psyche.
About the eventual exercises, what do you think is going to happen in the world?
Well, Russia, I think, has made its point with this. forces will go, back to Russia. Um, another important point to be made is there's a internal audience for this also, and I think sometimes that's not appreciated. That is, the Russian Navy is making a point to the rest of the Russian military that it is still a viable force, because with the war in Ukraine, the focus is on the Army particularly, and then the Air Forces secondarily. The Navy has done particularly badly in the Black Sea. So this is the Russian Navy's opportunity to say, hey, we are still a player. And when you look at the budgets over the last 20 years for the Russians, the Russian Navy has been at the end of the line.
All right, Mr. Kansian, thank you very much for all those answers.
Well, thanks for having me on the program.